Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon to talk about 10 ways to drive employee engagement in crisis. My name is Stan Phelps. I'm going to be leading the webinar this afternoon. A little bit of background on myself. First off, I've had an opportunity on 3 different occasions to come over to Bahrain and to be able to do some programs with EMIC training. So super happy to share a little bit of guidance as we go through this very challenging and difficult time. We're going to talk today about a concept that I call the green goldfish, and we'll get into why green and why a goldfish. But a little bit of my background. So I am a Forbes contributor. I've been a TEDx speaker, worked with IBM as what's called a futurist. And my work is looking at the future of both the customer experience and employee engagement. I've written a number of books, too many. They all have one thing in common, and that's this idea of a goldfish, and we'll get into how the goldfish is a metaphor. And I live in the US on the East Coast. That's my wife, Jennifer, and I have 2 boys, Thomas and James. And we live in kind of halfway between New York and Orlando, Florida, if you can imagine that. So East Coast in the state of North Carolina, in a town called Cary, which is a suburb of the capital of North Carolina, Raleigh. And I want to start out today and tell you about a leader in the US. His name is Doug Conant. And a number of years ago, Doug took over as the CEO of the Campbell's Soup Company. And so if you're familiar with Campbell's Soup, it's a big company here in the US. And at the time when Doug took over, it was a time of crisis for Campbell's. They weren't innovating. The culture was in shambles. The stock price was at almost an all-time low. And Doug came in and very quickly started to change things around at Campbell's. And he started to do a lot of little things to drive the engagement and build the culture at Campbell's. So a couple of things that he did is every afternoon, he would change his work shoes and put on sports shoes and walk literally 10,000 steps around the headquarters in New Jersey, just dropping in and connecting with people and engaging. And the second thing he did, because Campbell's is a global company, is that he would spend a little time each day writing handwritten notes to the employees at Campbell's. Now, you would think, well, why wouldn't he just send emails individually? Well, at the time when he was CEO, he had a lot of factory people. Only 50% of the Campbell's workforce had a company email. So he would write these handwritten notes. And over the course of almost a decade as the CEO, Doug would write over 30,000 handwritten notes to his employees, recognizing them for the work that they were doing and their contributions to the company. And at the end of his tenure, innovation at Campbell's was at an all-time high. The stock price was through the roof, and the culture and the engagement was off the charts. And it was a symbol of doing a lot of little things that made a big difference. And so I highlight this because we're going to talk about 10 different ways to drive engagement. It's really going to set the table for one of the more important ones. And it's this idea of recognition. So I want to ask you a question, you watching this webinar right now. I want you to think back to your past. When have you been the recipient of meaningful recognition? When have you had a leader within your organization recognize you? How did they do that? When did they do it? Think back. I'll give you a few seconds for that. I'm going to imagine, and I can think back to cases in my career when I've been recognized, that was actually a really good memory to think back to that moment when you were recognized for your contribution. And it was probably pretty powerful. And the reason why is that I'm going to go into a little bit of brain science. The way that our brain works is that we are hardwired to be able to seek out that recognition. So it turns out that almost 80% of how we view the leaders that we interact with comes down to just two questions. And they were based upon our earliest days of evolution. You know, when we walked out of the cave, that we asked two questions to everyone that we came into contact with. And the first question was this: what is the intent of this person towards me? And very quickly, number two, what's their ability to carry out that intent? So what is their intent? What's their ability to carry out that intent? And over 80% of how we view other people comes down to just those two questions. And so if you think about it, if you break down that intent and the ability to carry it out, social psychologists call this warmth and competence. Warmth and competence. And let's look at how this plays out as we look at these four brands right here. So many of you probably familiar with BP. It's a global company, British Petroleum. Especially here in the US, how would most people view BP? And here's the thing: you can be viewed as high warmth or low warmth, high competence or low competence. And so most people would look at BP, especially in light of about a little over almost a decade ago, Deepwater Horizon, where they had the oil spill in the Gulf. Most people would put BP right down here. And how do we feel when we interact with companies or leaders that show that they don't have the right intent, and two, they're not very good at what they do? And here's the thing: it's not a very good feeling. In fact, we might have a sense of anger or disgust when we have to deal with them. The next one is the U.S. Postal Service, but think about your own postal service. I can only speak to the U.S. Postal Service, but where would you put them on this matrix? And for me, I'll tell you my personal experience. I used to have a wonderful mailman. So when he would come and deliver the mail each day, he would have a dog biscuit for my little dog, McMurphy. And he was just a wonderful guy. His name was Joe. But here's the thing: if I needed to get a package on the other side of the US to California overnight, is there any chance I would walk into the US Postal Service? And the answer is probably not. So I think you could make the case that they maybe have the right intent, they're high warmth, but their ability to carry it out is low. And so for companies or leaders here, you might look at somebody and you want them to do better, but for some reason, they just can't do better. How about Rolex? That's a brand that we all know. Where would you put Rolex on this idea of warmth and competence? Now, Rolex probably makes one of the best timepieces in the world, but they're a little exclusive, right? So I would think most people would put Rolex down here to the bottom right. And how do we feel when we interact with those that we're not quite sure of their intent, but they're very good at what they do? And here's the thing. We might create a sense of envy or jealousy if we're a brand or a leader that's right there. Now, what did Doug Conant and Campbell show by these little things that Doug did? He showed that they were both high warmth and high competence. And here's the thing. If we can show that we're high warmth and high competence, we can make that journey to the heart and actually instill a sense of pride in doing business with that company or working for that company. So this kind of lays the foundation for these little things you can do that I call them a green goldfish. Just about 8 years ago, I started on this quest to find over 1,000 companies that did little things to drive the engagement of their employees. Now, what was interesting when I did this, there happened to be a survey out of what was the happiest place in the world to work. And so this was back in 2012, 2013. And so if you had to guess, what do you think the happiest place to work in the world was? It was this. Search no further. Google was the happiest place to work. And so I started to look at Google and why people thought that it was the happiest place. And so when you look into the background, this is Larry Page, who's one of 2 people who founded Google. Larry Page, a number of years ago, gave a graduation speech at the University of Michigan. It turns out Larry grew up in Flint, Michigan, which is Flint's one of the big automotive cities. And during this speech, Larry told a story about his grandfather who worked in the automobile plants in Flint, Michigan. And he was telling the story. He told the story about he can remember going over to his grandfather's house and coming across this thing called an alley-oop hammer. So an alley-oop hammer is a steel pipe with molten lead at the end of the pipe. And he can remember as a kid that if they were putting a tent and they needed to bang a stake into the ground, that he would use his grandfather's alley-oop hammer. And it turns out, as he shares, that it turns out his grandfather used to take this hammer to work with him every day. He used to not to work on the assembly line, but it turned out back in the time they used to have these things called sit-down strikes, and it could get violent. And Larry's grandfather would bring this hammer with him as a weapon, as protection. And so Larry shared that when he created Google, he wanted to create a place that people felt safe being at, and a place that people would even want to show up, even if they weren't being paid. And he said, isn't it a good thing that we live in a world where people no longer have to bring a weapon to work with them? But that really laid the foundation for what he wanted to do at Google. And it really sets up, from a leadership perspective, one of the most important drivers of engagement. In fact, studies will show that there's about 75 different drivers of employee engagement. But here is the number one. And this is so key from Google and Larry setting the example. The number one is the extent to which employees believe that their leadership has a sincere interest in their well-being. And so we're going to talk about 10 things today. That's number one. The extent that you can show that you're going to have a sincere interest in their well-being. And how does that start? It starts with transparency. This concept of opening up the window of information, being as transparent as possible, especially during a time of crisis. Now, if you can see this picture in the background, this is a picture from Amsterdam in Holland. Now, I used to live in Amsterdam for a few years back in the days when I used to work for Adidas. And you'll notice that these canal houses, they have these massive windows. And one of the most interesting things is that they have no shades on the windows. People from the outside can look in. And this became a great metaphor. It's not mine, but there's a CEO named Vineet Nayar who talks about the theory of the Amsterdam window. And the story is he visited a friend who had one of these canal houses with, like I have, a massive window, right? And it turns out he asked his friend, he said, well, you know, why do you keep it wide open? Why don't you cover it up? And his friend said, well, you know, we don't get many sunny days here in Amsterdam, so it's nice to see the sun, or we want to be able to have a nice view of the beautiful canal in front of our house. And then he said something that was really revealing. He said, it forces us to keep the inside of the house clean. The fact that people can see in from the outside. And so I love this as a metaphor of when you open up that window of information, right, and you make things as clear and transparent as possible, it forces you to act in a way that shows that you have the employee's interest and their well-being at the forefront of what you do. All right, I mentioned this idea of a green goldfish is all about engaging your employees. My first book was all about the customer. And this is the thing that I learned, is that you can't have, if you want to have happy customers, you can't have that unless you have happy, engaged employees. And the research shows that if you have engaged employees, you grow 3 times as fast as your competition. Your turnover goes way down. Your performance spikes. I mean, it just makes sense that if people feel like they're in a place where they're valued, that they're going to do better work, and ultimately the customers are going to be happier. Now, I mentioned the metaphor for this is the green goldfish. Really quickly, why a goldfish? And the goldfish was inspired by a hotel chain we have in the US and Canada. It's called Kimpton. And so none of the hotels are called Kimpton, they're all boutique hotels. But the thing is that this hotel chain really gets the idea of providing a great experience, not only for their customers, but also for their employees. So if you stay there, there's always gourmet coffee in the lobby. They do wine tasting in the afternoon. You can bring your dog. They're pet friendly. They do a lot of little things that are different. But the reason why they help inspire this idea of the goldfish, that at some of the Kimpton hotels, if you're staying there with your family and maybe you're missing your family pet, they used to give you a pet goldfish for your stay. And it's a program that they called Guppy Love. And I love it as a little signature little thing that they do that is different from most other companies. Now, the second reason it's probably more important is when I was a boy, my first pet was a goldfish. And so this is me when I was 6 years old. If you can imagine, I had a lot more hair back then. But I went to like a carnival or a fair, and I brought home my very first goldfish. And I remember him, he was small. In fact, the average goldfish is the size of your thumb, about 10 centimeters or 3 inches. Well, if you had to guess, what do you think the world's largest goldfish is? You're going to be looking at it in a second. The world's largest goldfish is nearly 50 centimeters, nearly 20 inches. And to put that in perspective, that's the size of an average domesticated house cat. Nearly 6 times the size of average, right? That would be like walking out of your home or apartment and bumping into somebody who is 3 stories tall, 6 times your size. That's crazy. Somebody who's almost 9-10 meters tall. It's just crazy. And so it turns out, I was intrigued by this, that the growth of a goldfish is impacted by 5 reasons. But here's the thing. The business of everyone that's on this webinar is impacted by the same 5 factors. And so we're going to break down these 5 factors, and we'll see if you can get them. Here's the first one. The goldfish's growth is going to be impacted by the size of the bowl or the pond that they're in. And this is a direct correlation. So the bigger the bowl, the bigger the pond, the more the goldfish grows. So what's the size of the bowl or the pond if you're in business? It's simply this. It's the size of the market that you serve, right? Makes sense. Here's the second one. It's super easy. Their growth is also impacted by who? The other goldfish that are in the bowl or the pond. And this one is an inverse relationship. So the more goldfish that are in the bowl or the pond, the less typically the goldfish can grow. So who are the other goldfish? It's the competition. So we've had the size of the bowl, we've had the number of other goldfish. Here's number 3. The quality of the surrounding, the water that they're in, will determine how big they can ultimately get. So the more clear the water is, the more nutrients that are in the water, the more that goldfish typically grows. So what's the quality of that environment if you're in business? Well, it's simply this. It's the economy. And I don't have to tell you that what we're going through right now is having a massive impact on everyone. And I know that it's great that the Bahrain government has stepped in and is covering wages for the next 3 months. That's tremendous. I only wish that our government had that foresight, but there's going to be ramifications. So the quality of the water that we're in right now and the economy, it's very murky, right? It's not clear. It's not nutrients. So the economy affects how much you can grow. My business was thriving up until a month ago. We're entering a new time. Here's number 4. how that goldfish does in its first 4 months of life will ultimately determine how big that they get. So they're tiny when they're born. They're the size of the top of a pin. So how they get out of the gate is absolutely key. So the first 120 days for a goldfish are key. What's that in business? It's simply this: how you do when you start up your business. So think about this. Even if you launched a new product or service within your business, how it does in this very short amount of time will be an indicator of how well it will do in the long term. Here's number 5. Genetic makeup. So what is that business or that goldfish born with that separates it from all of the other goldfish? And the stronger their genes are, the more that they're separated, typically the bigger they get. So in business, what is genetic makeup? Genetic makeup is this: it's differentiation. How do you stand out from your competition? How are you different? How do you stand out in what myself and my co-authors would call a sea of sameness? All right, so if really quickly, if the background of the 5 factors, really the goldfish is a metaphor for the importance of being different, of not only how you handle your customers, but also how you handle the employees and your team members. Now, why green? All right, green is an ode to this iconic American city. And unfortunately, this city is one of the hot spots in the US right now for COVID-19. It's New Orleans. And it's an ode to New Orleans because of New Orleans' most famous event. And that event is Mardi Gras, which Fat Tuesday, it's around the Lenten calendar. But it's a big celebration that they have in New Orleans. And it turns out that the 3 colors of Mardi Gras are purple, green, and gold. And so that was part of the inspiration, because there is one word that comes from New Orleans, Louisiana, that exemplifies this idea of doing a little bit more for your employees. And it's a word that American author Mark Twain, back in the 1800s, described it as a word worth going all the way to New Orleans to get. And that one word is called Lagniappe. Lagniappe. So it's French and Spanish, Creole, combination of French and Spanish. It literally means the additional gift, or to give more. How do you do the little things that go beyond the transaction for a customer? Or how do you do the little things that go beyond simply the paycheck to demonstrate to your employees that they're vital? All right, so really quick, I mentioned I collected like 1,001 of these examples of companies that did little things to go above and beyond and establish and drive that culture of engagement. And what's interesting is when you look at 1,000 of anything, you start to see the patterns of how you can do this. So for the last half hour, I want to share with you, get into the rest of the 9 ways that we can share these types of green goldfish. And we're going to go through a couple exercises for you to do a little bit of sharing within the chat and to have a discussion of how you can apply some of these principles right now in your business. So we're going to, again, we've talked already about transparency as one of the 10 ways. We're going to share another 9. It turns out that when we looked at this, there's 15 different ways that you can do this. Today, we're just going to cover 10. But there are 3 that exist at the bottom of this framework. And there are 3 B's that we do with this framework. The bottom level is what we call the building blocks or the basics. These are things that you have to get right if you want to move up to higher level concepts. And so we'll talk about shelter, wellness, and what we call here in the US modern family. And so it starts first with shelter. And shelter is really a metaphor for the entire workspace that somebody has. And the idea that the space that they have shouldn't dictate the culture, but rather the space they have should reinforce the culture that you want in your organization. Now, I imagine just like the US, you're under a stay-at-home or work-from-home order. So a lot of people, this may be the first time that they have worked from home. And so they now have to establish a workplace where they can be productive. And so as an employer, think about the things that you need to do to be able to enable your employees to be more productive and be engaged. Part of that could be the technology platforms that they have. Part of it could be their entire setup, the chair that they use, the monitor that they're going to be looking at, even the microphones or the headsets that they'll need to use as they do more virtual meetings. The next type is wellness. And it's based on this idea that you can't have happy, engaged employees unless you have healthy employees. And this is probably more important now than ever as we're in this global pandemic. So what ways can you be able to provide wellness resources as your employees are under this stay-at-home order? So first off, could you give them potentially any telemedicine resources? Can you give them tips to be able to stay healthy and keep moving and exercises? Could you do some stuff from a mindfulness or meditation, give them access to apps where they can do breathing exercises? Anything that you can help them to be more well during this time of crisis can be that little something extra. The fourth one is what we call modern family. I am what's considered a Generation X person. Generation X occupy right now the majority of leadership positions within organizations, but we're also, a lot of us that are Gen Xers are also, and millennials, are also what's called the sandwich generation. So we've got Gen Xers have 2 generations above us, boomers and matures, and we have 2 generations below us, millennials and Gen Z. It also means in our home, we're dealing with childcare, and we're also potentially dealing with, our parents and elder care. And so how can you as a company help your employees deal, especially in this stressful time, of managing both their kids as well as their parents, and understanding that we might have to be a little bit more flexible given all of the challenges that we face with COVID-19. All right, so I want to do a little bit of an exercise. I want to we're going to open this up to the chat, but do me a favor. If every person can share just one idea, maybe that your company is doing, or one idea that you can think of to promote more wellness during this crisis. Type that into, if you can, the chat. I'm going to open the chat right here. Feel free to contribute. I have to move around here in my office. My lights automatically go off if I don't move around. Feel free to type in, is there anything that you can be doing to promote wellness during this crisis? It could be telemedicine, it could be exercises. Okay, I love this from Andrew. Collective virtual fitness sessions. And we're going to talk about team building, but I love that as an idea of why can't you do that? Can everyone share a resource? I love this from Robert of, hey, what's something that's on Netflix, or is there a video that you can share to be able to make at least a little bit of comedy or lightness? This is a great one from Miriam. How can you be more productive with all of these virtual meetings, right? I imagine from a wellness perspective, having shorter virtual meetings would be better. So how can you all be more productive? That's great. Mohammed said the internet, that's a great distraction. Ramla, I like this. Tips for managing stress, right? Maybe, again, there are apps out there that and free resources for meditation, for breathing exercises. I love that. Miriam, time management exercises. Oh, I like this. From Nada, if you have a nutritionist on staff or someone that you can contract, a lot of people are stress eating right now. How can you get them to feel like they're eating more nutritious? That's great. Share personal stories, right? Be able to open up an outlet. So these are great ideas. Thank you guys for sharing. We're going to do another exercise in just a few minutes as we go to the next level. So we covered a little bit of the basics there. Now I want to jump up to the middle rung. And if you notice that this is a triangle, if any of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's kind of how this is based. You have very basic stuff at the bottom, and then it starts to level up to higher level needs. And so the second B is things that we do to create a sense of belonging, to feel like we're part of something. And so flexibility, recognition, transparency, team building. Let's jump into flexibility first. So we're living in a time where everyone is at home. The typical 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or 9 to 6 business hours are being disrupted, right? I think it's important for employees to have a little bit more flexibility, not so much on how things get done or when things get done, but just on what gets done. And it's based on this idea that work is no longer where we go, it's what we do. And so how can we be more flexible? We have a retailer here in the US called Best Buy. They pioneered a concept called ROW, which means a results-only work environment. Meaning that people aren't watching the clock of when somebody comes in or when they leave, right? As long as you get your work done, there shouldn't be a difference. And it turns out when they pioneered this, the research showed that the employees were 30% more productive, and they were 30% happier with having that flexibility. Now, I always like to share this example. This is a 2-person company in New York City, which is the big epicenter for the US for COVID. But this is a small PR company called PR Freelancer, just 2 people, the owner and 1 employee. And it turns out the employee dates a New York City policeman. Her fiance was a police officer. And so when you work at New York City police officer, you work 5 days on, 3 days off, 5 days on, 2 days off. That's how they do their shifts. And so what the owner of the company said to her lone employee, when your fiance is working, you work. When your fiance is off, you're off. Gave her the flexibility to be able to work the days that she needed, and it didn't matter as long as she got her work done. So if you can do that in a 2-person company, there is no excuse why you can't be flexible. Recognition. So recognition is absolutely important. We started this webinar with the importance of recognition. Recognition really comes down to just 2 words. And this is a friend and fellow speaker. She says it comes down to just this: you matter, right? Your employees need to feel like they are recognized for what they do and who they are. And here's the thing, most people look at recognition the wrong way. They look at recognition as something that happens after the fact. If you do X, you get Y, being recognition. And that's the wrong way of looking at recognition. As a leader, we should recognize early, often, and understand that recognition actually fuels the performance that we want. So if we can recognize early and often, we're going to get more of the behavior that we feel is important, and the employee is going to get the recognition. Now, here's the thing. It doesn't have to be expensive. This is a Danish software company called Valtech, and one of their core values is positivity. And they simply have this purple elephant that they have at the office that gets passed around the office each week when somebody demonstrates the core value of positivity. And that person gets to display the elephant on their desk. That doesn't cost. I mean, what does it cost to get a stuffed animal? Almost nothing. Number 7, team building, right? How do you do things to be able to bring your team together to create that sense of belonging? Now, this used to happen around the water cooler or here in the hallways, but how are you replicating it now as everyone is dispersed and working from home? How do you find those opportunities for people to have these connections and hallway conversations? I always like to share this story. There's a company here, Pixar, that makes all of the animated great movies. They're now part of Disney. But there's a great story that when Steve Jobs was building out the new space for Pixar, that they purposefully put the bathrooms in the center of the building because they wanted to create opportunities for people to connect from all around the building. It kind of sounds weird, but it makes sense to an extent. So exercise number 2, similar to what we just did for wellness, I'm going to open the chat again and give you a minute or 2. But how could you share an idea of how to be able to promote more team building during this time of crisis? How can you come up with an idea that can bring people together even though we're apart? And so let me open the chat. Ooh, I like this from Miriam. Have a little bit of a 15-minute coffee talk, right? Love that. Great way to start the day. Perhaps everyone goes around. I love it using Zoom. You can have that kind of tic-tac-toe, panel. We would call it like the Brady Bunch view, but have everybody go around and share one thing that, one frustration. Next day they can share a small victory. So that's great to have group chats and virtual check-ins. Have lunch virtually together. I like that. Everyone shows up their computer. They get to show what they, extra points for having creative stuff. Robert says weekly quiz or competition. That's great. Each Friday I'm doing, I do a joke, a riddle, a story, and a trick. One of my books is called Bar Tricks, Bad Jokes, and Even Worse Stories. Great. Love this from Mark. Weekly pub quiz. Have a virtual happy hour. I love that you're creating the pub quiz. And here's the beauty of technology. And our kids are probably the best at this, right? What have they done? They've just done what they always do. They go and they're playing games together online. They've got their headsets on. A lot of things that we can emulate. All right, so we're on the by the way, I'm gonna share the last three. Feel free in the chat or the Q&A to be able to put questions in there. But let's jump to, and we're gonna do questions at the end. Let's jump to the final three that we want to be able to talk about. And these are at the top of the pyramid. These are things that we do to create what we call becoming. How do you help somebody become a better version of themselves? Training and development, paying it forward, empowering your employees. These are things right at the pinnacle. So really a couple of quick examples. This is from a company called Evernote. They do a thing called officer training, which is the idea that anyone can raise their hand to be part of this program. And once a week, they get put into a meeting with another department within the company. And they get to see how things work from different parts of the company. And it was based on this idea that if you're going to be a naval officer in the US and work on a nuclear submarine, officer training means you have to know every job on that submarine before you can become an officer. So great example, paying it forward. All right, so as a company, how can we create opportunities for our people to be able to give back and help each other and be in service of other people? So think about programs that you can do that your employees can contribute to or give back to. The more that they give, the better it's going to be for them in terms of feeling better about themselves and their own situation. And lastly, empowerment. This is an example that comes from, this is a global company, 3M. They're famous for creating what's called 15% time. So what they allow their engineers to do is have 15% of their daily time where they can put it towards a project of their choosing. So how do you give them time to be able to own something and explore their own creativity? Really quick, because I want to go back to training for a second. This is a time we talk about, typically we never have time for training. And there are great virtual trainings out there. So there's no excuse that you can't, when your employees have a little bit of downtime, to give them opportunities, whether it's through EMIC and programs like this, but give them opportunities to learn new skills, to round out and get them to become more productive and more engaged. Great. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. I've got a final story at the end and a little bit of bonus, a little bonus that I want to share with you. But with that, I'm going to go back into, I'm going to actually jump out of screen share mode, and you get to see fully me. And then I'm going to open the chat. Oh, let me open the chat. So feel free to type in there if you have any questions. Oh, first, before we get to questions, looks like, oh, I love this because we've got Easter coming up. Can you have a little bit of a contest in terms of Easter egg design? Any other questions as it relates to these 10 things that we talked about? Again, we started with transparency. Then we did some of the basics, right? And I think the thing that we did a little bit of brainstorming on is wellness, right? And then there were the mid-level concepts like transparency, which is what we opened with, as well as recognition. You know, how are you reaching out as a leader potentially and scheduling check-ins with your employees? That's probably more important now than it's ever been. But feel free, if you have any questions, to type them in the comments. If you don't have any questions, that's absolutely fine. Again, we've got a final story and a bonus that we're going to share with everyone in a second. I'll give it maybe another 30 seconds if anyone does have any questions. Okay, I'm checking the Q&A and the chat. I don't see anything. Okay. Okay, we do have, okay, a couple of questions have just come in. Great. So we have time to challenge. What other forms and examples of empowerment are there? So great example, Google actually built upon 3M's 15% time. And they actually do, for their engineers, they call it 20% time. They went 5% louder, I guess. But here's the thing, especially for your younger employees, the millennials and the Gen Zs that are now entering the workforce, why not be able to give them some smaller projects that they can own and be able to build? And this is a great example now, as we know that creating that sense of belonging and team building is important, is why not give them an opportunity to create some of these team building programs? Here you go, great. How does body language play a role in virtual meetings? How to avoid miscommunication if all the communication is done remotely? I do think that body language is absolutely important. In fact, studies have shown that when you're communicating something with feeling, I'm communicating something with feeling, only 7% of what I communicate are the words that I use. 55% of what I communicate, when it's something with feeling again, is my body language and my gestures. And 38% is the tone of my voice. So here's the thing. I actually think being able to see someone is an improvement on texting someone or emailing someone, because in email, it's you have to be very careful. People can assume things about, again, your intent, that warmth piece. So I do think that that is actually important. I think it's actually an improvement that we're doing more face-to-face. So I would actually encourage people to make sure that they are sharing their video. You can do some things with virtual backgrounds. So if you're not in an ideal situation, let me see if I might have time for one more question. Okay. Concept. This is about the concept of road. Does it really work? Some employers expect business to operate as usual, even at these difficult times. How to convey the success of this experiment. So here is the thing. I think this is at the heart of, does it really work when you give your employees flexibility? And here's the thing, it absolutely works. And the studies show that. And here's the thing, it used to be that your giving flexibility was an added bonus. Now it's, especially for younger workers, it's becoming an expectation that they can do their work remotely and at their own time of choosing. So I think that, in fact, these younger employees are actually making decisions on where to work based on flexibility. And they actually view that as more important than even the money that they're being paid. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump into just the last story. And like I said, I've got a little something extra for you guys. I'm going to go back to my presentation. And really quick, okay. Really quick as we wrap up, if by chance, I'm not sure if you're going to have access to this, but if you have an Amazon account that's in the US, I am in the midst of doing 29 free ebooks. So today, for example, is April 8th. So the diamond goldfish is free on Amazon. So you might want to take a screenshot of this, but you can see tomorrow, it's the yellow goldfish. That's all about happiness. So that's my little extra for you guys. I want to finish really quickly about a story about Disney. And this is it. When Disney first started, Walt had an idea back in 1957. He decided he wanted to do a parade right down Main Street. Now, to do that, it was going to cost $300,000 US to hire the people, to build the floats, to do that little extra. His accountants and finance people freaked out. They said, don't do the parade, Walt. The people are already going to be here next month. They're not expecting the parade. They're not even going to miss it. And Walt said this. He said, that's exactly why we need to do the parade, right? We need to always do more than what's expected. So my challenge for you is to think about ways that you can do these little green goldfish, right? And it's not a big thing like a Trojan horse. It's this little thing that you can do. We call them Trojan goldfish, all right? Roll them out one after each other, right? Do these little things to drive the engagement. How you handle your employees now in this time of crisis is going to echo for years later. And so you have an opportunity to either cement the loyalty that you have for your employees, or you can miss an opportunity to make this a special time. And with that, I hope you're thinking a little differently. I'm going to challenge you to think what we call outside the bowl. And thank you for taking your time today. I really appreciate it. My name is Stan Phelps. I want to thank Emic for allowing me to share this with you. I'm going to be coming back next week, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit on how you can excel under pressure. But until then, thanks for having me, and we'll see you next time.